Thank you for the introduction, Kelsey, and everyone, thank you for joining us for this webinar. It's great that you're here. It's great that accessibility is something that you care about and that you're thinking about and that you want to include in the way you do your job and the way you work. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today, and none of you should be expected to be an accessibility expert at the end of this discussion. But it is my hope that we're going to get a strong baseline of the kinds of things you should be thinking about and the kinds of things that you should feel like you can do and the kinds of things you feel like you can work with your organization to move forward in a proactive and constructive way so that you can get some positive momentum and really actually start doing some good, thorough work that you're proud of. So we're going to break into a few topics today. If there is an elephant in the room, it's typically accessibility law and the things that we have to be doing according to one or many different state or federal groups. We're also going to get to information for content managers and providers. For many librarians, this is you. You are not someone that's creating all of the stuff that you catalog and circulate. You are more responsible for managing content, for describing it, for cataloging it, for distributing it. But we will also look at information for content creators, the people that are working with content to actually include accessibility features like closed captions. We'll talk about next steps, which is really important. And in addition to the accessibility law stuff, sometimes the other elephant in the room can be, how can we possibly achieve all of this stuff that we're supposed to be doing, especially for organizations, institutions that have a large body of content. You see a pile of rules and you realize there's no way we can do this, either with the money we have or the people that we have available to do it. But there are some ways that you can move forward in positive ways. And sometimes the best news that you can hear is that it's actually impossible for you to achieve accessible perfection. And that's a good thing because it lets us get rid of that feeling that we have to do all of this stuff and we don't know how, so let's give up. Instead, let's do the best we can and let's put a plan in place to figure out how we move forward with that. And then finally, there will be lots of time for questions and discussion. And please, if you have questions during the webinar, please share them. This doesn't have to be a monologue. I am very happy to have a discussion as things come up. So getting into the legal considerations for accessibility, if you are publishing content, whether it's video content or information on the web, unless you live in a very small circle, it's pretty likely that there is some oversight organization or government group that has laws and guidelines and rules that apply to you. The first of those is Section 508, which comes from the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This is a federal law that says, first of all, any resources that are used by federal employees have to be accessible. In addition to that, any information published by the federal government has to be accessible. For many of you, that probably means, well, we're not federal employees, we're not a federal organization. But it's something to keep in mind if you receive federal funding for some of the work you do. Because in theory, if you were doing a lot of work with federal funding and you were using those resources in a way that wasn't accessible, that funding might be taken away. So that is a consideration. There's also the New York State Information Technology Policy, which is essentially the New York State's version of Section 508. It's very similar, and this one would probably apply to some of us. Even if we're not state employees, if we are publishing content that is going to be served under an organization that might be funded in some way by the state government. The good news about both Section 508 and the New York State Information Technology Policy is they subscribe to guidelines called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That's something we're going to talk about very shortly. But the good news of those is that there's a really direct reference of the things we're supposed to be doing to comply with those laws, and it's really well written. And by the way, you'll see me every now and then referring to WCAG 2.0, which is the guidelines I just referred to. The levels of that the state and federal government point to are A and AA. There are 3 levels of WCAG: A, AA, AAA. To give you an idea of the kinds of things those would represent, is A might be closed captioning a pre-recorded video. So that's sort of the bare minimum of the kinds of things we're going to be looking at. AA might be live captioning video instead of just pre-recorded. That becomes a lot more challenging, but technically it's the kind of thing that we should be considering in our workflows. AAA is sort of the extra level that is enforced by no one as far as I know, but it's got some really interesting stuff, like even including a sign language interpreter with a video, which is a really great thing to do if you can do it. So in addition to those, there is the Americans with Disability Act. They also have writing that says anything that we do digitally has to be accessible. The challenge and the difference between ADA and Section 508 is that Section 508 points to a set of guidelines which says we want you to follow this. ADA sort of just says we want you to be accessible, and let's just make it accessible and be done with it. So sometimes it can be a little bit unclear about the kinds of things we have to do for ADA, but they also have some writing that helps you reconcile how to move forward in a way that's constructive and not terrifying. So I have a lot of links here for extra reading. We're not going to open these now. And all of these resources are going to be made available. I can take all of these links and resources that I'm pointing to in the presentation so that it's things you can look at later. So this is really just the references to some of the things I was just talking about. In addition, though, there's some reading both from companies called Level Access and Site Improve. These are 2 companies whose jobs is accessibility. It's all they do. And these are some things where they're talking about not only their interpretations of ADA, but where they see it going, because the state of the Americans with Disability Act as far as digital accessibility is incredibly volatile right now because of some legislation that's going back and forth. So if ADA is something you're concerned about and it seems like you can't get a good grasp on what you're supposed to be doing, that just means you're paying attention, because it's really hard to follow. And also finally, if you end up doing work for broadcast, for television, FCC has their own rules, but for most of us who aren't in broadcasting, that's not really something we have to worry about. So getting into WCAG, the good news about this is not only is it something that many of our state and federal guidelines are referencing, it is written and maintained by the WC3. This isn't just a group that said, hey, let's make some rules for accessibility. This is the international standards organization that writes the rules for the WWW. So if you know what HTML is, which is the language that the internet is written in, essentially, they write the guidelines for HTML. So this is a group with a lot of authority that's writing these guidelines. So they're well written and they're well respected, because this is coming from a group that really has the first say in how things are done in the internet. And I wanted to include their introduction here because I emphasize something here that I think is really important to mention. Because we're talking about time-based media today, which really means mostly video and audio and things that have other timing associations. Usually we're looking at visual and auditory accessibility. So when we're looking at a video, you typically have to see things to understand it, and you have to hear things to understand them. But there's also a lot of other kinds of disabilities that we just want to be aware of as we're working. And you can see that there's an entire list of talking about cognitive abilities, language, learning, neurological disabilities, things like that. And if learning more about those kinds of things interests you, there is some new writing in WCAG 2.1 called User Stories, which sets a lot of examples for different kinds of people and the kind of the accommodations that they could use and the kind of ways that they navigate information. And I also included a link to a book titled A Web for Everyone, which is a little bit of an expansion for that. It's an entire book on design principles for the web. And it also includes, with a lot of their guidelines, examples of those extended user stories and how those things actually apply to people. These are really interesting reads if you're interested in how people interact with information. So most of what we'll be looking at for the sake of WCAG today is Guideline 1.2, which is time-based media. To give you an idea of what that 1.2 means, WCAG has four main principles, the first being perceivable, meaning when we put information out there, it needs to be done in a way that people can perceive it. So for those visual and auditory things, it means that if we're putting information in a video in a way that you have to see it, we need to make sure there are alternatives to that so that if you can't perceive that information in the video, you have another way to absorb it. And the point two just means as part of the perceivable principle, time-based media is just one part of that. And again, this is just what we're going to be focusing on today because WCAG is quite expansive, and to cover that is a completely different monster on its own. But time-based media stresses the importance of captions, descriptive audio, and transcripts. There are about 10 or 12 sections of this guideline, but this is really what it boils down to, is we've got closed captions, because if you can't perceive the audio of a presentation, if it's in captions, you can read it. There's also descriptive audio, which can be a lot more challenging to do. And that's really thinking about a video from the other perspective, where if there is something in a video presentation that you need to see in order to understand, then we need to have an alternative for that. And the most common alternative is that that information is also available in the audio track. And finally, transcripts. You won't see transcripts out there as often because we'll see that they're actually only required when we're looking at content that doesn't have timing involved. So when we have a video, usually there's audio that goes along with it, and the timing of that video and audio together are important. But if you just have, say, a podcast or an instructional video that doesn't have any audio in it, it doesn't have the same kind of synchronized timing where there's audio and video information happening at the same time. So when you have just a video or just a podcast, you're really looking at linear information. It's just beginning to end, and you can put that in a transcript, and it's completely accessible. And actually, a transcript can be even more useful for maybe individuals who want to absorb content at their own speed and at their own pace, or maybe even someone who English isn't their primary language, and they can take your transcript and run it through a translator and still absorb that, where they wouldn't be able to do that with the captions of your video, possibly. So Guideline 1.2 also includes guidance for things like sign language interpretation, which I mentioned, extended audio descriptions, which are really challenging, and alternatives for live audio. And it's great that these are AAA because they are incredibly useful features to use, but they're also very hard to do. So for example, an extended audio description would be, if you needed to describe something in this webinar, I'd have to make it work properly, I'd have to stop every 10 seconds and just let there be silence, so that after the fact, we could edit in more information into the audio track to make up for what you're missing on the screen. Or you'd have to take a video and add pauses so that you'd have audio descriptions. And again, there are times where this is a really great feature to have, but it's also really hard to do, and it's time consuming or it's expensive. So starting out on the first of those three, there is the transcript. So this is only required, like I said, for pre-recorded audio only or video only. And there is, as far as I know, there are actually no writings that say a transcript has to be done in a certain way. So you have to provide a Word document, or you have to provide a text document, or you have to provide it in a website. The only thing that's important is that if you have a transcript as an alternative for something, whether it's a podcast or whether it's a video, that transcript should be easily available and easy to find from whatever it's associated with. So if you have a list of podcasts on a page and there's a separate page on your website buried 4 levels in that has your transcripts for those podcasts, that's not going to work because someone may not even be able to find the transcripts for them. But if under each of those, the link to the podcast, there's a link to the transcript, it's directly associated with that. And now not only is it easy to find, but you can use that to show off and say, hey, look at all these podcasts that we're putting out, and we have this transcript associated and tied right with each one. That makes it look like you're doing a really good job. And again, just because we only have to do this with certain kinds of content doesn't mean you shouldn't. Especially when you have, say, something like captions. It isn't that hard to get a transcript from a caption file. And if you want to make a transcript as a sort of supplemental piece of information, great, do it. For a library, that might be especially useful, say, if you have a video that people might use for research. If this video is an hour long and someone has to try to figure out where in that hour-long video is the 2 minutes of stuff that's relevant to their research, they've got to scrub through your video, and they're probably not going to find it. If you have a text transcript, it's going to take them 30 seconds to find what they're looking for, and they're going to be very glad to have that transcript. And a fully descriptive transcript is a nearly universal alternative to your content. And by fully descriptive, I mean that in the transcript, it not only describes, say, what's being said, but it also describes all of the other meaningful and important stuff. So if I had something explode on screen right now, the transcript would probably describe that if it was actually meaningful to the presentation. So the next part is, once we get by the transcript, captions are sort of the ubiquitous accessible feature for online video. It's something that, first of all, as far as WCAG, it is a level A requirement for all of our pre-recorded and AA for live audio and synchronized media. And that synchronized media means that the audio is associated with something else in a way that the timing is important. And that's a good distinction to know. For example, if you have a series of videos where it's just a slideshow and there's some music in the background, and you already have a transcript for all of that, you can, in theory, caption that, and if you have the time and resources to do it, that's excellent. But what you're dealing with, say, a slideshow that just has music associated with it, they're not synchronized. You could take that music and completely shift it 20 seconds in either direction, and it wouldn't affect the meaning of anything. So I stress that synchronized part is something to keep in mind, and it's something to also just understand, because that'll help you know when are these captions necessary. So by the way, you may have noticed there that this is technically required for live audio. And this is the first part of the presentation that I'd say we've gotten to that's really challenging to do as far as the things that we're actually supposed to be doing. And later in the discussion, we will get to sort of how you plan out how to achieve these things, or how to set goals to move toward them, if you're stuck wondering, how can we even accomplish this with the resources we have? So don't be scared of that just yet. By the way, closed captions or open captions are allowed. Typically, the term captions and closed captions get used interchangeably, but what those actually mean is that closed captions are captions in a video that can be turned on and off. Open captions are captions that are always there. You might wonder why you'd ever have open captions, but there are some times where maybe, first of all, you always want them on, but also there might be some environments where closed captions aren't supported. For example, a lot of organizations do engagement through something like Instagram. Instagram does not support closed captions in their videos, so you'd need to plan ahead if you're going to do engagement over Instagram, and if you'd like to do videos, you've got to plan ahead for how you'd like to do captions, or how you'd like to have an accessible alternative to your Instagram videos. So if we were doing this webinar maybe 10 or 15 years ago, we might spend a lot of time just looking at making captions on your computer. And if that was 10 or 15 years ago, that's probably where we'd be spending a lot of our time, and that's where the kind of thing you'd be working on. In the last few years, Some of the services that do captions, even things like YouTube, have gotten really good at automatic captions. You shouldn't rely on them, but you need to include that in some of the things you're considering, because sometimes if you have a pile of content and you look at the money or the people resources you have, you realize we can't manually caption all of our stuff, or we can't pay some company $10,000 to caption all of our content. Is there a happy medium? Sometimes the automatic caption option can be a way that you can start moving in the right direction as a happy medium. Because again, if you can use automatic captions to get your videos closer to where you need to be, you can now spend a half hour editing a video instead of maybe the 8 hours it would have taken you to do it from scratch. So I'm just going to take a quick look at a video I uploaded to YouTube a few evenings ago. And with this, I can stress the importance of having clear audio in a video, because this is a video I did in a quiet room with only myself speaking to my cat. You're not going to be able to see this, or excuse me, you're not going to be able to hear this through the webinar, but we can look at these closed captions and you can read through, and you'll notice in this 22-second conversation I had with my cat, Jack, so I haven't touched the captions in this video. I haven't edited them at all. YouTube, even though this is only 23 seconds, did not make a single mistake. And it's really impressive that it's able to do this. And this isn't just something that's available in YouTube. If you have a video content management system, or if you're working with some other video platform, this is probably an option that you'll have available to you, even if it has a cost. Typically, when you look at captioning services where they do the work for you, and they actually send you a usable caption file, you'll usually be looking at about $1 to $3 per minute of content, which if you have one video doesn't cost a lot. If you have 10,000 hours of content, that suddenly becomes an unfathomable number. You might have a built-in service though that does automatic captionings for 4 cents a minute, which compared to $2 a minute is a huge difference. And then if you want to make sure that your captions are properly usable, you hope that your content management system allows you to edit your captions right from it. And we can see that I can do that here. And I could go in and make sure that my capitalization is correct, make sure I have some punctuation that makes sense, make sure that it understood that I was saying Jack and not Jacques. But if I wanted to go through and fix up these captions, it would probably take me about a minute to do. All right, goodbye, Jack. So again, I bring this up because sometimes, especially if you're featuring, say, a 2-minute video, it really isn't that much work to just caption it from scratch. But if you have a library of content and you realize we need a way to start moving forward, you should maybe look at that as one of your many options to explore. If you are looking for an actual editor that you can use on your desktop, there is a great little editor called Cadet. And this is actually put out by WGBH. This editor was previously called Magpie, so if any of you were doing captions in the past, it's very possible you were using a service called Magpie. This is an updated version of that, and it is here and is free to use. WGBH surprisingly does some very good work with accessibility and the services they provide. And finally, there are plenty of other options you can explore. I included Amara.org as an example to illustrate 2 points. One is that you could go to their website and upload one of your videos to there and edit your captions using their editor for free. And from there, You can even share that video out so that you can have contributors working on that video for you. That's not the only system that does that. I'm just using it as an example. But the reason I bring that up is because as someone that might be cataloging copyrighted information, you should be mindful of doing things like that, because first of all, you're now distributing this copyrighted content online, and you may not be able to pull off fair use for that. When you actually get into accessibility and captions and fair use, there are some strange things that when you get there, you might want to talk to your copyright officer or your legal representative about for the organization. If you're using content for fair use, there are times where someone could technically not only make a fair use claim against you, but say that you didn't have the right to add captions to that because it's not your content, which is a really strange thing to say. But I hope you never have to worry about that. But be careful about using online platforms for captioning. Make sure that that content is being done securely and is not being added publicly in a way that you might get a copyright claim. So there are way too many services to list here, but I did include a link to DCMP, the Described and Captioned Media Program, has lists of vendors for captioning, for transcripts, for things like that. And you can tell by this list that there are more than you need to know here. I would add, though, that the link for WGBH in this document needs to be updated. So if you're looking for them, you can find them at access.wgbh.org. So now that we've seen some of the editors that you might work with in closed captions, instead of sort of taking a technical look at how you use a closed caption editor, we're going to talk about some concepts for improving closed captions. Because again, there are so many different tools you can use for captioning, and it really doesn't matter which one you use as long as it's integrated with your workflow, or if it's something you like, great, use it, do what you're comfortable with. But universal to all of those systems are some of the things you can consider when you're writing closed captions. Because if you have a caption file that includes all of the important and intentional stuff that's being said on screen, you have a very good start, but you actually don't have a complete caption file. And there are some things that we can and should be adding in to make that caption file more usable and understandable. So the first is sound effects and music. And by the way, I am referencing some guidelines from the DCMP captioning key. This is a great organization that is administered by the National Association for the Deaf, and they are fully funded by the US Department of Education. So again, this isn't just a group that's saying, hey, we like this stuff and we'd like you to do it this way. This is a group that has a lot of knowledge and authority to say, these are some really good ways to do things. So when you are including sound effects and music in a video, typically they're there for a reason, and they're not just some car was driving by in the background with their music blaring. And if those sound effects and music are there in the video for a reason, either to deliver information or to say, set the scene or set the move, it's important that that is in the caption file as well. And we'll look at a few examples of these in the next slide. So the next is speaker identification. So this is actually something that, looking back at our friend Jack in the interview we did with him, that video was captioned, but if you couldn't hear my voice, it may not be clear who's talking. Did we just include an animated version of Jack speaking to the camera? We don't know, because you couldn't see me speaking. So we could have included a bit at the beginning of that video that's just showed that it was Casey or the narrator speaking. There's also some special considerations to add in for things like inflection, or a word being said a certain way, or maybe a different language being spoken to help clarify what's going on, or to help understand how and why things are being said. So here's some examples of what some of those captions might look like. So if you have a video that's showing off all the great stuff the NYLA is doing, you might include a narrator tag at the beginning of that to show off, oh, it's a narrator speaking. Next example is you have audible language as well as other meaningful sounds being described. So imagine you have a commencement speaker coming to address a campus, and that person it was really controversial that they were being invited to campus. And they come up to the podium and they wave and they say, "Welcome, class of 2020." And then for the next 10 seconds in that file, as you're reading the captions, it's just dead silence. Well, did you just witness the entire crowd cheering and applauding, or did you witness the crowd turning their back on the speaker to shun them? If that's not in the captions, you might not have any idea what just happened. So some of those things can be really meaningful, even though someone cheering and applauding doesn't necessarily have information in it. So next in line is music. Again, if there's a car driving by behind you blaring their music in the video, it doesn't necessarily have any meaning or importance. But if you intentionally put that in there, even if it doesn't have information, it's being used to set a tone, and it's important that someone can understand that. Or even better, if you're including a song, and that song is being used importantly, and those lyrics it's being chosen because you want people to see those lyrics. You would include those lyrics on screen as they're coming through. And finally, there might even be times where background noise is important. So if you ever listen to something like NPR, you might hear at the beginning of an interview with someone that they have some background noise that they've included intentionally. It helps set the scene. It helps you understand where this interview is coming from. So birds chirping and leaves rustling. If you are outside taking a video and you didn't include that sound intentionally, it's just background noise, that doesn't mean anything. But if you included that intentionally to show, hey, we're outside, that's important in the captions. And above all of this, for all of these rules, context is important and judgment is important. What you interpret in the video is so much more important than any rule. And the example I like to give for that is 3 different groups of people at a train station, all taking their own video. That first group might be someone that's there just to make a video of talking to some professional that they're traveling with. They happen to be at the train station waiting. So they're recording some content, and there is a train behind them coming to a screeching halt. They don't react to it. It's not there for a reason. It's just in the background. That might not have any meaning or importance for those people making that video. And it's up to you to decide, well, do I even put that in the closed captions? But let's go to the next group, which is a journalist who's doing an article about the degrading conditions at the train station. And they're there to talk about some of the things like that. And they include that train coming to a halt right behind them in the very beginning of this interview. Suddenly that's important because that's there for a reason. For that person, that caption, including that noise, is critical. And then we can go to the third group, who's just a bunch of friends sitting around making a fun video. And they're talking about something that has nothing to do with the train, but this thing comes to a screeching halt behind them. And the entire group makes this terrible, ugly face and starts looking at each other. And that noise means nothing, but their reaction to it does. So if that isn't described in that closed caption, someone that's watching this video who can't hear or perceive that sound has no idea what these weirdos on screen are doing. But you include that little sound that says train coming to a screeching halt, it suddenly makes sense. So that's what I mean about how context is important, and that same event on 3 different videos can mean different things. So it's sort of up to you to decide what's important for that caption file. And if you can't hear something, what do you need to know about it? So after captions is audio descriptions. And this is a little bit more of a challenging topic than captions because it's frankly harder to do. Closed captions, even though when you have a lot of content, becomes a challenge. But if you just have a short video, it's simple enough to type in your closed captions. When you're working with audio descriptions, though, the work becomes a little bit more hands-on. And so according to the WCAG guidelines that we looked at before, in synchronized media, which means there's typically audio and video tied together in a way that the timing matters, important visual information should be included in the audio description. And it can also be used instead of a transcript for pre-recorded video only. So for example, if you were making a short video of how to navigate your catalog and there's no audio in it, or there's just background music, and you're not also there talking about how to navigate it, you could add a descriptive audio track that describes all of the steps you're doing and all of the things you're doing. And also, if needed, pauses may be added to make room for descriptive audio. But again, that's not something we need to do. It's just something that we can do. I also included a link to a audio description video from University of Illinois. It was their holiday message, and I love the way they did it. I can't present it to you through the GoToMeeting webinar because it's not going to play the audio for you, but I encourage you, if you're interested, to check it out later. Essentially what they did is they have a few minutes of looking through the lives of these students as finals are coming up, and it was just music playing in the background. So they made a separate version of this video where it's actually describing what each of these people is doing. And the audio description version, I think, is actually more interesting to watch than the regular version. They did a really good job of it. But the reason I like to use it as an example is because at the end of the video, I believe the college president comes in and gives a short talk to the viewers, the people watching the video. And because they do that, they turned that video from just a pre-recorded video with no synchronized audio to a video with synchronized audio, which now suddenly needs closed captions and descriptive audio. So it's the kind of thing to think about, that if that video had been made just with the first minute and a half of it without the president at the end, they actually wouldn't have had to do that audio description part, which would have been unfortunate if they didn't, because again, it's a really interesting, fun video. So I've also included some of the stuff from the DCMP description key. So before I talked about DCMP, which has a lot of awesome stuff that you can do for captioning. And actually, I should step back to show you a short example of the captioning key, because at first I was really confused about how to navigate this site. So this is from DCMP, which I mentioned before, which was a tool put out there by the National Association for the Deaf. But they put together a captioning key with all of the guidelines for how they think captions should be produced. But the thing I wanted to point out here is that you navigate this through the arrows at the top of the nav bar to get from text, language mechanics, presentation rate. By the way, if you are looking at content management systems that have things like a built-in caption editor, look for things that also have clues for things like presentation rate and things like caption length, because those are things that a caption editor can determine and say, hey, that caption you just made is probably too long, or that caption you just made isn't on the screen long enough. So those kind of things can be really helpful when you get to the point where you're evaluating and possibly implementing captioning tools. So in addition to this captioning key, there's also a description key. So that has information for what to describe, how to describe, and then a bunch of extra resources. I'm not going to spend much time on this today, because it really getting into descriptions and the kinds of things you need to do, you shouldn't have to worry about memorizing those rules where you are right now. These are the kind of things that I call references. Again, your judgment and context is really important to say, okay, what kind of information is in a video that needs to be described? And then again, you get to something where you have a question. Oh, I have a reference I could go to. Let's see what they think about this. They also have description resources for, say you do have a really good budget or a grant where you can get some audio description done for you. There are companies that will provide that service and that can do it. And there's also a list of vendors at the bottom here of vendors that can do that service for you. So that is the end of the first part for information for the people that are going to be working with just understanding the captions. Whether you are making the captions yourself or you are dealing with a system that's going to be working with it, we're getting on now to information for content managers and providers. So you're trying to put a system together to organize your videos, to catalog them, to make them accessible, to give your organization the tools that they might want to make that process easier. So if there are any questions about the web content accessibility guidelines, this is a great time to get to them because we're about to somewhat move on from that. So first of all, we are getting to other considerations for web content accessibility guidelines. So let's say you have perfectly captioned every video in your catalog, and you even managed to get audio descriptions in there everywhere you needed them, and you have a transcript that goes along with every video. You have spent $100,000 to do this and 1,000,000 minutes of human time to make it done. And then you have put those on a platform that isn't accessible. So someone can't navigate to that point in your content with a screen reader. It doesn't matter that you've done all that work because someone can't get there. So even if they can get there, it's very important that you consider the video player that you're using. And I'd encourage you sometime to reconsider the environment that you usually absorb videos, whether that's through YouTube or Vimeo or something, and try to figure out how you would operate and navigate that video player if you couldn't see it. So normally if you want to, pause a video or turn the volume up or down or turn the closed captions on and off, you take your mouse and you go find that button and you click it because you can just visually scan and see where that thing is. If you are using something like a screen reader, you need the player to do a very good job of getting you to those tools, because if you have to dig through 40 different tabs to get to the closed captions, you're going to stop before you get there and you're going to give up. And also look for extra keyboard shortcuts. A lot of the times, say in something like YouTube, you can push 2 keys on the keyboard to get the video into full screen and to turn the captions on. And if you are looking at a content management system to manage your videos, look for built-in support for things like transcripts. Is there a place that you could upload them so that they are tagged with the video? Look for something that has a closed caption editor or integrations with automatic captions, or even some of those other white glove services that'll do the captions for you. Because if you have to get your videos out of your video platform into your caption platform or your descriptive audio caption platform and then get it back into your normal publishing platform, you've introduced twice as much work of just moving your content around. So if that stuff is all in one box, you're going to save yourself a lot of time. And then again, for the viewers, however that content is being published should be accessible, not just the video, but however you navigate there. Then the even more challenging thing is the contributors. So these aren't the people visiting your website or visiting your catalog. These are the people that use it. And let's say in part of your organization, there is a person who is visually impaired that's going to be working on some of those videos. That might be an extreme case, but it's possible. And does the system you're using have, say, flexible features that might make some of those things exposed to a screen reader? A more common example of this might be, say, a newspaper who has a catalog of all of their photography that's been done, and one of their journalists needs to be able to access that catalog. You might say, well, they don't need to, they can't see the photos, so why do they care about the photos? Well, it's their job to be able to find the photo that goes along with the article they're writing. So if those photos have text descriptions that go with them, they've been empowered to do their job. By the way, depending on the browser you're using and the environment you're using, if you try to do keyboard navigation for the sake of getting an understanding of what it's like, you may find that nothing's happening. So keep that in mind. There are some browsers and some operating systems where you actually need to turn that option on. So I've included a few extra links if you need to reference those for, say, keyboard navigation in Firefox, and then the Chrome and Safari keyboard navigation shortcuts. And finally, if you're ever at the point where you want to get an idea of if something actually is accessible beyond just can you use your keyboard, there are some tools you can use to do that. One of those is the Wave Accessibility Evaluation tool. This is a free tool for you to use. And with this, you can just open up a website. Sometimes it takes a half minute or so to open it up. And that's going to give you a description of all of the errors and alerts in a website. You don't need to know what each of these errors or alerts means, but it is good to know if, say, 100 errors and alerts come up, that it might be something you want to look at. So I just brought up my YouTube home here, and I can see that I have 190 errors and 340 alerts. If this wasn't YouTube, but it was, say, a content management system that you were looking at for your organization, that might be the moment where you say, we need to understand why all of these errors and alerts here and what they mean. It might not necessarily be your job to understand all of these, but that might be a clue that says, we need to investigate this more, or we need to ask the software provider their perspective of this. Because if we're seeing these 190 errors, it probably represents an accessibility issue. And if we open up the Smart website in that same system, we're going to see a much smaller list. And by the way, if you're seeing 3 errors or 3 alerts, don't be too concerned. To get something down to no errors and no alerts can actually be a pretty big undertaking. But this is more of what you'd expect to see from a regular functional website. There's not 100 errors and there's not 200 alerts. And you also see things documented like features and structural elements that are listing things that were done the right way. And finally, I mentioned before when we were talking about ADA, a company called SiteImprove that had a listing of their interpretation of where ADA was going. They also have an accessibility checker plugin for Google Chrome that you can install that uses the same criteria as Wave, but it presents that in a much different way. And sometimes they actually find different things. So they can be good to use together to actually get a bigger picture of what some content looks like. So in addition to being a little bit aggressive and actually looking at the accessibility of a product that you're investigating, including accessibility in the purchasing process is so important, because once you have handed over a bag of money to a company, unless you have a contract about how accessibility will be handled, it's up to them to decide if they're going to work with you. But if you're including things like this in your purchasing process, you're asking the questions when they're still at the point where they're interested in getting your money, and so they will want to work with you. Getting a VPAT, which is a voluntary product accessibility template, is a giant start in that. And that's really gonna help cross off 2 things. First of all, it's going to let you see the company's their interpretation of their own accessibility features and shortcomings. So when they send you a VPAT and they say, oh, everything is golden, great. You could include that in your contract that they will maintain that. Or even if their VPAT says everything is great and you use those tools and those tools say there are problems, you can say, well, the VPAT that you provided us is not correct. What can we do about this? Also ask for version 2. So VPAT has been around for a little while. Go ahead, did I hear your question?
Yeah, there is. Are there many differences in error rates or finding errors between the different browsers?
No, the browsers, there shouldn't be much of a difference. The only thing that should be different is if you're using a different tool. So what you might see in browsers won't be error rates, but you might see different responses to errors. So for example, one of the 4 principles in WCAG is robust. That's principle 4. That basically means that a website is made to the specification of HTML. If a website is not robust and there are errors in it, you might see a different interpretation of that if you load that page on Firefox in Chrome. But if you bring up these accessibility checkers in both of those browsers, they're going to find the same errors. They just might be illustrating in different ways.
Great, thank you.
Yep. So, okay, so for a VPAT, make sure you're getting a version 2, which is a newer version that was updated last in December 2018. The reason for that is the original VPAT, which was put out a while ago, didn't include the specification for that WCAG 2.0. So it might not be relevant, it'll probably be outdated, and it might be really challenging to read. If you get the version 2, it's going to have a much easier to follow and much easier to read readout of that group's accessibility. And again, that applies directly to also the Section 508 stuff. So in addition to all of those WCAG requirements, it can also include some of the Section 508 stuff, which most of the time overlaps into the same thing. All right. So that's everything I wanted to cover for the content managers. There's also some information, though, for the content creators, which doesn't necessarily mean it is you taking the video and recording your cat on the couch, but it could also mean you are the person that needs to work with other people to organize their content and help them produce it.
Casey, before we move on too far, we do have another question.
Sure.
This one is, Site Improve offers recommendations for things like things that checkers don't catch, like the accessibility within AR/IA menus. How problematic are errors that it recommends for developers as opposed to webmasters and editors?
So there's sort of two questions in there, but first of all, the extra stuff that Site Improve gets to can be really helpful, but in general, they're more important for the web developers or professionals who can understand the meaning of what it's saying. So when there's an alert that comes up, if there's an issue that comes up, everyone knows that that's a problem. But for example, if it brings up an issue with maybe a more technical question, like ARIA landmarks. So these are sections of the web page that help people understand what they're going through if, say, they're using a screen reader. That might be, for example, the heading of a page, the footer, the main body, the navigation. When a typical person uses a website who is not visually impaired in any way, they've got great vision, they can read everything, we browse through content by looking at stuff and understanding it based on looking at it, and we can determine a lot about the relationships of those things by looking at them. So we know what the navigation to a website is without them having to put a giant sticker on it that says this is the navigation bar. But for a screen reader, it's actually really important for something like the navigation to be tagged. Within those roles, there can be things like navigational sections that really don't have any meaning, that are just there to work as boxes. And if one of those were put in and wasn't tagged properly to describe what it is, Site Improve might say, hey, we found this landmark role and we don't know what it is, and you should probably look at it. That's important for the web developer or the person that understands it to say, oh, actually, we didn't need to use a section there. We should have used a div instead. Great. But if it's someone who is just looking at the content to figure something out, whether it's accessible or not, that might not have any meaning to them. And it could be concerning to say, oh, there's this error here, and I'm not sure if I should be concerned. Does that help answer the question, or was I off base of what you were looking at there?
I think so.
Okay, thank you. So for information for content creators, the biggest thing I can stress is that clear audio is critical. And that covers so many things if your audio is good. First of all, if your background noise is bad or if your audio recording is poor, some of your audience, even with perfect hearing, is going to struggle to hear that. But some of the rest of your audience, who maybe isn't deaf but is hearing impaired, is not going to be able to absorb that content, and they're going to have to rely on something like closed captions. Furthermore, though, we mentioned before how useful automatic captions can be. If your audio quality is not good, those automatic captions are useless. So if you can work ahead to make sure that you have pristine audio, then you save yourself potentially a lot of work in having to go through and recaption that video, especially if the captioner can barely hear it, because that's going to make the captioning process more challenging. So also plan ahead for environmental conditions. You know, if I was giving this webinar in August and there was an air conditioner running, I might want to plan ahead to make sure I wasn't sitting right next to that air conditioner, because then in your recording, you have to resolve the fact that I am talking over an air conditioner. Maybe if you are recording a presentation, you need to plan ahead for, you know, are the lights going to be turned down? Is it important enough to have a spotlight or a light on the speaker so that you can see them in the recording? Things like that can do a lot for your quality. But also, we've talked about how hard alternative audio descriptions are. Do everything you can to minimize the need for audio descriptions. Not because audio descriptions are bad, but because if you plan ahead for the videos you are planning or producing, you can make them in a way that doesn't need certain audio descriptions, and it's just more inclusive. So to think back about our video of Jack the cat there for a second, where I just throw the camera up on Jack and I start talking. If someone wasn't able to perceive visually what was going on in that video, they might be a little bit confused with me just starting off the interview. If I had started the video by saying, I'm sitting alongside my cat Jack on my couch. He looks pretty disinterested, but I'm going to talk to him to see what he thinks about a few things. Just even starting ahead with that helps so much, because it's building in that audio description in a way that doesn't feel like an accessible tacked-on feature. Another thing that can be really helpful to do for that, especially when you have videos that you can plan ahead for, like a scripted instructional video, are making sure you're being clear with the language you're using. So if you have a chart that shows that people's participation in NYLA events has gone up 20% in the last year, there's two different ways you could say that. You could say, you can all see in this chart that we're doing a great job. Or you can say, as you can see in this chart, our audience participation has gone up 20%. The first way that I presented that language would need an accessible alternative, because I'm not giving you the information in audio that you'd need to understand the point. So if you can't see that chart, you're losing that information. But in the second way, even though you may not be getting every cell in that chart, you're getting the meaning and the point of the chart. So anytime you can plan ahead for stuff like that in your script, great. It's a little bit more challenging to do in something like a webinar like this if I'm not going from a script. But if you're mindful of it, you can be aware of the things that you're saying and realize, oh, there are ways that we can say this that just make the video stronger and won't require a Band-Aid to make it accessible. So again, yes.
Sorry, we do have another question that slid in.
No, go ahead.
We have an attendee who creates video content with Final Cut Pro. They figured out how to make the closed captioning, but are unclear what to do with it afterwards. So what format should they export the closed caption text file as? And then the second part of their question is, what do they do to link them after compression and upload to an HTTP fast start web server for delivery?
Okay. So for the second part, I don't know that much about that that specific server, but there should be documentation on the kind of captions that it can use. But in general, for looking at the first part, if it depends partly on how much you're doing in a caption file. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff you can do, say, with the styling and the alignment of captions, to make them more readable or to make it more clear who's talking based on the captions are. But when you do something like that, you might need a more specific caption file, such as, say, a VTT format that includes some extra styling stuff. If you're not doing all of that, you want to use the most basic caption format possible, such as, say, an SRT caption file, which is almost a universal that can be used by just about anything. And in some systems, that is the default that it wants. But again, using the most basic caption format that you can use is great, because if you make something like an SRT and you find out in your system that it requires some other more specific format or even a proprietary format, you should be able to get from an SRT to that. But if you start with something odd and proprietary and then you need to get back to a basic file, you might be more challenged to find something that can actually convert it. So I can't help with the second part without knowing the kind of captions it wants, but I can say that the most important thing to know is whether or not there's extra stuff in that caption file other than the text and the timing.
Thank
you. I'm sorry that that's not a I'm sorry that's not a full answer, but that's a partial answer. Okay, so again, thinking about audio descriptions and the things that we can do to avoid that is using language that echoes the visual information instead of relying on it. You know, another example might be is if at the end of a video for an event that's coming up, you have, you know, the date and the name of a webinar or an event. Great. If there's room in the audio track, why not narrate that as well in the video so that you can hear it and it's not just a thing you have to read? Or say you wanted to put the full conference schedule in the video. You've just made it really challenging for some people to get to that information because you've crammed a lot of stuff into a video. So why not instead take that conference schedule and put it in the video description or put it in the actual conference website where it belongs, so that you're not creating something in your video that doesn't need to be there, where now you have to say, oh, I have to make this accessible. Okay, we're gonna pause the video right there and we're gonna have someone read the entire schedule for 2 minutes long, which you can do. And if you do it, great. But keep in mind, if you don't wanna have to stop and add a pause there and add audio descriptions, maybe there's a better place for that pile of information that you've just put in a video. So we just got to a lot of stuff that in theory we should and can be doing to make our stuff accessible. And like I said in the beginning, it's really impossible to abide by every little millimeter of the things we need to get doing. Even if you caption all of your stuff and you do a wonderful job of it and you start doing audio descriptions and you put them in your videos where you need to get them, any reasonable human is going to miss some stuff. So don't try to say we have to hit this mark of this law and this law and this law, or we can't publish our content because we'll get sued. Instead, get a plan in place of how you move forward, knowing that perfection is not the goal, but that doing the best you can and making this work part of your workflow is important. So for the people that are actually making your own content or just publishing it, you don't have a lot of stuff, great. Start doing captions. It will instantly improve your videos. It could make them more searchable if those captions are being searched. And again, if you don't have a lot of stuff, it isn't that much work. And it's one of the things it's just a given for accessibility at this point, where if you have videos that aren't captioned, they are not accessible. And while you are captioning that content, now that you understand some of those things that we were talking about with visual information in the video, be mindful of that and start making notes that says, oh, while I was doing captioning, I noticed this chart or this information in the video that maybe we want to respond to or see if we can improve. So make room for accessibility during production, not after. Accessibility is not the Band-Aid you put on at the end. It is something that is so much easier to do when it's part of your workflow. So think about things like that while you're doing your work. Think about, did we just introduce something that needs an audio description because we could have done it a different way? For organizations, the biggest thing you can do is create an action plan. Assuming there is no switch that you can push to make everything perfect as far as accessibility, the best thing you can do is create an action plan. And this isn't just me saying that. Despite the fact that ADA's guidance can be a little bit shaky at times or incomplete, in their actual guide, which isn't the most pretty thing in the world, let's see if we get to page 8 here, they have an entire section that describes how you develop an action plan for providing accessible websites. So not only is this a really good thing you can do to start figuring out how you move forward, but if you are worried about a lawsuit, if you have an action plan in place and the ADA comes to you and says, hey, we've noticed there's some inaccessible content, you can start that conversation by going, yeah, we're working toward that. Here's our action plan. Here's the things we're trying to do. Here's the specifications we're holding ourselves to, and here's some of our guidelines. That might be the difference between them saying, okay, we're going to go into mitigation with you to make your content accessible, or we're going to start putting fines. Or with the action plan, they might say, oh, great, it looks like you really have a good plan in place. We'll be back in 6 months to see how you're doing. So with that, start by evaluating your needs. Do you have 3 videos or do you have 3,000? What are your resources? You know, do you have 12 cents and one person with 5 minutes that can set aside for this? Or do you have a good amount of funding that could be used? There's no right or wrong answer to that. It's just the kind of thing that you need to be aware of and include in your plan so that you can set reasonable priorities and figure out what you can do. So create an accessibility policy that actually states what you're going to do with accessibility and the guidelines and things that you're going to hold yourselves to. And make it part of your organizational culture, not you, that one person, are the police that go tell people that, oh, your content's not accessible, we have to fix this. You include it in your training and in your workflows and in your policies that these are things we do. And they're important not just because the law says we have to, but because we want to do good work and we want to do things that we take pride in and that we do take pride in it. And then finally, create and publish an accessibility statement. This is incredibly important. So an accessibility statement is basically a web page that you put prominently on your website, sometimes right in the footer, that might describe what does accessibility mean to your organization. And you know, that'll be typically a pretty narrative thing, but it's describing that this is something that's important to you. And then what have you already done to make content accessible? So you know, we've done this, this, and this to meet these guidelines. And then also what still needs to be done. So you know, we've identified this content and these web pages that need to be addressed, and here's what we're going to do about them. And finally, how should someone reach out to you for assistance? So this is a great way to add in an extra feature so that if every inch of the content that you publish isn't accessible, someone knows exactly how to reach out to you. And not only do they know how to reach out to you, but they can see in your accessibility statement that you want them to reach out to you. You want to hear from them, and you want to know if there is content you have out there that they cannot access. And that can go a long way to be the difference of someone talking to you, which is what you want. You want to hear from that person. If, oh, great, we're so happy to hear that you wanted to get to this content. Let's work with you and let's figure out the best way to get this to you. Versus that person saying, this organization doesn't care about me. I'm going to start a lawsuit. So again, this is something that is coming right from ADA. Develop a plan for making your existing web content accessible. Describe your plan on an accessible web page and encourage input on how accessibility can be improved. Let visitors to your website know about the standards or guidelines that you are using to make your website accessible. So again, it's narrative, but it's also measurable and quantifiable. So if you're using WCAG 2.0A and AA as your benchmark, say that. And say what you're doing and say the things that you still need to do to make that a reality. And when setting timeframes for accessibility modifications to your website, make more popular pages a priority. And that goes the same for your video content. If you have 500 videos that have collectively been watched for 1,000 hours, and 5 of those videos have gotten 90% of those views, do those 5 right now. And then for the rest, you put your plan in place for how do we do the other 900 hours of this content, or however much it is. So I'm sorry to say I'm assigning a little bit of homework for everyone. First of all, mindful navigation, thinking about accessibility, can really help you understand the differences in the ways that people navigate information if they're not visual navigators. Again, I mentioned before that when we get to a website or we get to a video player, we can build relationships in our head about what headings mean. Oh, I can tell I can tell the heading mindful navigation applies to this tab I just made because there's a visual relationship there. On a website, those headings are made intentionally to do the same thing. Your navigation is built so that someone knows that it's a navigation. There are so many visual relationships that are built that we take for granted because it's just so natural that we don't even think that that's an accessibility thing, that those visual relationships are something we need to convey in accessibility. So also when you open up a video, figure out how you access things like the volume control, turning on closed captions, and then give that a try using your keyboard. It's going to be really challenging. It's not easy to do for a screen reader, first of all, but for those of us who don't have any experience on a screen reader, it's even more challenging. Not just because we've never done it before, but typically someone that uses a user agent like that has customized it to work exactly the way we want. So it's a little bit like driving a car if you've never driven before. If you don't have some lessons first, and if you don't adjust the seat and the steering wheel the way you want it, you're going to be stuck thinking, how does anyone possibly do this? But the ways we do it are, first of all, we make sure that that car is adjustable to fit you, but also we make sure the roads are built appropriately to accommodate that vehicle. So if you were using a screen reader, how would navigation change for you? Instead of that visual browsing, how would you expect to find the information you're looking for, whether it's a website or you're scrolling through a video? And then also for captions and descriptive audio, take a moment and record a short video, upload it to whatever video platform you like, and then not only get those captions in there, but think about the things you've done in that video that have information in them that is meaningful to the video, that wasn't just you talking. Again, if we look back at that video of me talking to my cat, the captions there pretty much did the job for me, but there's still some information in there that would be lost if you couldn't visually perceive the video. So did you create any meaningful or important sensory information? And the sensory information just means, are there things that you needed to see or things that you needed to hear in order to understand what was going on or get the full picture of what was going on? So given that, we have time for questions and thrown produce.
Great, thank you, Casey. We'll give everyone a couple of minutes to get their questions in from the presentation as a whole. I want to thank you again, and I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us this afternoon to talk about this incredibly important topic. And we'll give, like I said, we'll give everyone a couple of minutes to get their last minute questions in. And Casey, if you have anything that you want to add while we do that, that's absolutely fine.
Great, thank you. So while we're thinking about questions, I should add that there's some good news that you should never typically be expected to know the right answer to anything. That again, context is important and your discretion is important. And an example of that I can give is a little while back, I was working on a video that actually was like a slideshow that really didn't have a lot of meaningful synchronized audio added to it. So I'm a member of the Web Accessibility Initiative interest group, which is some of the same people that work with WCAG, as well as a lot of other interested parties throughout the world who want to keep up with accessibility and some of the stuff that's going on. And I reached out to this group to get some perspective on, hey, what do you think about this? And the only answer I got back was one person who was actually in a pretty good position to have some authority that said, you know, it's a good question. Here's my interpretation of it, but I don't think anyone is going to be willing to make a determination on this. So sometimes there are questions on this where you really do have to go with your judgment and go with what you think works best, because there might not be one right answer.
Thank you. We haven't had any questions come through, so we can probably call it an afternoon. Thank you again to both Casey and all the attendees, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.